Journalist Julian Hayes vanished from the vast, unforgiving Mojave Desert in 1982. He was on assignment, chasing a story that he believed would change the world. For 12 long years, his disappearance was a phantom file, a cold case gathering dust in a forgotten county office. The desert kept its secrets locked away beneath the sand and sun. His family was left with nothing but questions, and a silence as profound as the wilderness that had swallowed him. The case was a mystery, a dead end, a tragedy without a final chapter. Until, more than a decade later, a team of geologists performing a routine survey made a chilling discovery that would not only solve the mystery of what happened to Julian Hayes, but would also unearth a conspiracy of greed and murder buried deep beneath the desert floor. What they found would change everything, proving that some truths, no matter how deep you bury them, refuse to stay dead. Julian Hayes was more than just a name on a missing person report. He was a force of nature, a man driven by a relentless and sometimes reckless pursuit of the truth. At 34, he was an investigative journalist with a growing reputation for tackling stories others were too scared to touch. His byline was a mark of integrity, but at home, he was simply a husband and a father. He was the man who made pancake breakfast for his 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, meticulously shaping them into lopsided animals that made her giggle. He was the partner to his wife, Eleanor, who understood and shared his passion, even as it terrified her. Their small apartment was a chaotic symphony of books, newspaper clippings, and Sarah's crayon drawings taped to the walls. Julian's life was a delicate balance between the darkness he investigated for a living and the bright, warm light of his family. His core ambition was to write one story, just one, that was so significant it would force real, tangible change. He wanted to expose a great wrong and make the world incrementally safer for his daughter to grow up in. This was the fuel for his fire. He had promised Sarah he would be home in 3 days, just in time for her ballet recital. He'd told her he was going to a place with lots of sand to find some bad guys, and that he'd bring her back a special rock. It was a simple, innocent promise, the kind a father makes 1,000 times. But it was this promise that would haunt his family, a simple, painful reminder of the life that was so abruptly interrupted. The emotional stakes were immeasurable. It wasn't just a career on the line. It was a future. It was first steps and lost teeth, school plays and scraped knees, bedtime stories and family vacations. When Julian vanished, he didn't just leave behind a mystery. He left a gaping hole in the universe of 2 people who loved him more than anything. Friends and colleagues remembered him as fiercely loyal and stubbornly optimistic. He believed in the power of the press, in the fundamental idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. He often quoted his own father, saying, "You don't stop digging just because the ground gets hard." It was a mantra that defined his work, and ultimately would define his fate. His last conversation with Eleanor was over a crackling payphone line from a dusty gas station. He was excited, his voice humming with the energy he always got when he was close to breaking a story. He told her he was onto something huge, something involving a powerful corporation and local corruption. He told her he loved her. He told her he would be careful. He promised. The life he had to live for was rich and full of love, a stark, painful contrast to the barren wasteland where his story would seemingly end. The final hours of Julian Hayes' life were a blur of nervous energy and calculated risks. He had driven his rented Ford sedan into Black Rock Flats, a forgotten town in the heart of the Mojave that felt like a relic of a bygone era. The town was small, insular, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. It was also the home of a massive industrial plant owned by TerraCorp, a chemical manufacturing giant with a less-than-stellar environmental record. Julian was there on a tip from a former employee, an anonymous source who spoke in hushed, terrified tones about illegal dumping. The informant claimed TerraCorp was burying barrels of highly toxic waste in the restricted desert lands surrounding the plant, a practice that was poisoning the local water table. For 2 days, Julian operated in the shadows. He checked into a rundown motel under an assumed name, paying in cash. He spent his time observing the plant from a distance with binoculars, mapping the patrol routes of the company's security trucks. He interviewed a few locals, but their mouths were sealed tight with fear or loyalty. TerraCorp puts food on every table in this town, one old man at the diner told him, his eyes refusing to meet Julian's. Best not to bite the hand that feeds. The air was thick with unspoken warnings. On his last afternoon, he met his informant one final time in a secluded canyon miles from town. The man, a gaunt figure with shaking hands, gave Julian a hand-drawn map marking a specific location in the desert. "They'd do it at night," the man whispered, handing over a sheaf of internal documents. "No lights. They know where to go. You have to see it for yourself to believe it." This was the proof Julian needed. It was a monumental risk. Going out into the pitch-black desert alone, into a restricted area patrolled by private security for a company he was about to expose, was a textbook example of what not to do. But Julian's drive overrode his caution. He felt the story, the big one, pulsing in his veins. That evening, he sat in his motel room, meticulously cleaning the lens of his 35mm camera. He laid out his gear, a powerful flash, extra batteries, a compass, and the hand-drawn map. He called Eleanor, the excitement in his voice palpable. He knew he was crossing a line, but the potential reward, exposing a massive corporate crime, seemed to justify it. Sometime after midnight, he drove his sedan out of Black Rock Flats, leaving the faint glow of the town behind. He followed a series of unmarked dirt roads, the car's headlights cutting a lonely path through the oppressive darkness. He parked the car where the informant's map indicated, tucked behind a rocky outcropping. He grabbed his camera and a flashlight and stepped out into the cold desert air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. He was moving towards the coordinates on the map, towards the truth. It was a fatal mistake, a final, courageous act that would create a legend and seal his fate. The discovery of Julian's absence began not with a bang, but with a growing, gnawing silence. Back in the city, his editor, a man named Marcus Thorne, expected a call. Julian was meticulous. He always checked in. When the first 24 hours passed with no word, Marcus was annoyed. When 48 hours passed, he was worried. By the 72-hour mark, the time Julian had promised Sarah he'd be home, Marcus was frantic. He had called the motel in Black Rock Flats, only to be told Mr. Hayes had checked out 2 days prior, leaving the key in the room. He called the local sheriff's department. The man who answered the phone, Sheriff Brody, sounded unconcerned, almost bored. "Folks get turned around out here all the time," Brody said in a slow drawl. "He'll probably turn up in a day or two with a nasty sunburn and a story to tell." But Marcus knew Julian. He wasn't the type to get lost. He pushed, insisted, and finally compelled the sheriff to send a deputy to check the route Julian would have taken. The next morning, a deputy found the rented Ford sedan. It was parked on a desolate service road, miles from any paved highway. The scene was unsettling in its stillness. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, as if the occupant had left in a hurry. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay Julian's worn leather notebook, flipped open to a page bearing hastily scrawled coordinates and a single, underlined word: proof. His wallet and credentials were in the glove compartment, but his camera, the one he took everywhere, was gone. There were no footprints around the car except for a single set leading away into the desert, fading quickly on the hard, rocky ground. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just the car, the notebook, and the vast, empty desert stretching out in every direction. The deputy's call to Sheriff Brody was concise. "Found the car. No sign of him. It's quiet out here. Too quiet." The news reached Eleanor an hour later. The initial report was sterile, official, but it shattered her world. The lack of detail was its own form of terror. It wasn't an accident scene. It was a scene of disappearance, a magic trick with no explanation. The disbelief was immediate, a physical shock that made the room tilt. Julian didn't just wander off. He wouldn't leave his camera. He wouldn't leave his family. As the initial shock gave way, a cold, sharp panic began to set in. The image of the abandoned car, door ajar under the merciless desert sun, became a permanent fixture in her mind. It was a question mark made of metal and glass, the start of a mystery that had no clues, only an unnerving, profound absence. The official search for Julian Hayes was a study in futility, a battle waged against an indifferent landscape and an even more indifferent bureaucracy. Sheriff Brody organized the initial effort, a small-scale operation that felt more like a formality than a genuine attempt at rescue. He deputized a handful of local ranchers and volunteers, forming a loose line to walk the desert floor. They were searching for a man in an area spanning hundreds of square miles of treacherous terrain, filled with canyons, abandoned mine shafts, and venomous wildlife. It was a hopeless task from the start. The desert itself was the primary antagonist. Daytime temperatures soared past 100 degrees, while nights dropped to near freezing. The vast, monotonous landscape disoriented the searchers, and the harsh sun beat down mercilessly. A helicopter was brought in from a neighboring county, its rotors beating a lonely rhythm against the sky. It scanned the expanse for 2 days, a tiny speck against the brown and ochre canvas, before being recalled due to budget constraints. Eleanor arrived in Black Rock Flats on the 3rd day of the search, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror. Her interactions with Sheriff Brody were tense and frustrating. He offered platitudes about the unforgiving nature of the desert and repeatedly suggested Julian had simply underestimated the elements. "Your husband was a city boy, ma'am," Brody said, his tone laced with a patronizing pity that felt like an insult. "This land, it doesn't forgive mistakes." He seemed to actively steer the investigation away from any possibility of foul play, ignoring Marcus Thorne's insistence that Julian was investigating TerraCorp. "That's a wild goose chase," Brody had dismissed. "TerraCorp is the backbone of this community." The family's frustration grew into a desperate anger. They felt stonewalled, unheard. They knew Julian. He was an experienced traveler, not a naive tourist. The official search methodology was flawed and under-resourced. Grid searches were incomplete. The search dogs couldn't pick up a scent on the baked, windswept ground. After a week, with no leads and dwindling resources, Sheriff Brody officially suspended the active search. He declared it a recovery mission, not a rescue, and stated that they would resume if new evidence came to light. The decision was a devastating blow. To the outside world, it looked like a tragic but understandable case of a man lost to the wilderness. But to Eleanor and Marcus, it felt like a cover-up. It felt like the desert wasn't the only thing hiding a secret. The search had failed not just because of the difficult terrain, but because of a fundamental lack of will, a deliberate misdirection that left Julian's fate buried under layers of official apathy and unanswered questions. The years that followed the failed search were cold and silent. The case of Julian Hayes slowly transitioned from an active investigation into a piece of grim local folklore in Black Rock Flats. He became a cautionary tale whispered to curious outsiders, the journalist who got too close to something and was swallowed by the desert. His faded missing posters, put up by Eleanor on her yearly pilgrimages of grief, eventually peeled and bleached under the relentless sun, their hopeful pleas turning into ghostly relics. The file sat in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, untouched, a closed chapter for everyone but the family he left behind. For Eleanor and Sarah, the passage of time did not heal. It carved the wound deeper. Every birthday, every holiday, was a fresh reminder of the empty chair at the table. Eleanor's hope, once a burning flame, dwindled to a stubborn, flickering ember. She fought to have him declared legally dead but couldn't bring herself to sign the final papers. To do so felt like a betrayal, like giving up on the man who never gave up on anything. Sarah grew up in the shadow of a heroic ghost. Her father was a collection of stories, photographs, and the one painful memory of a promise to bring back a special rock. The mystery of his disappearance defined her childhood, shaping her view of the world as a place where questions often went unanswered and justice was not guaranteed. The emotional toll was immense. The lack of closure was a unique and cruel form of torture, a permanent state of limbo. The community of Black Rock Flats, so tight-lipped during the initial investigation, absorbed the tragedy into its identity. The stretch of desert where his car was found became a grim, informal landmark. Teenagers would dare each other to go out there at night, to the spot where the reporter vanished. The story served as a dark undercurrent in the town, a reminder of the secrets the desert held and the power that TerraCorp wielded. For 12 years, this was the status quo. A family frozen in grief, a town shrouded in silence, and a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. The hope of ever finding out what truly happened to Julian Hayes had all but evaporated, leaving behind only the deep, lingering ache of a story without an end. The turn came unexpectedly. a seismic shift triggered by an event that had nothing to do with Julian Hayes. In 1994, 12 years after his disappearance, the world had changed. New, stricter federal environmental laws were being enforced, and the EPA had begun a massive project to survey old, potentially hazardous industrial sites across the country. One of those sites was the now-defunct TerraCorp plant and its surrounding lands in the Mojave Desert. The company had declared bankruptcy years earlier, leaving a legacy of questionable disposal practices. A federal geological survey team was tasked with mapping the area for potential long-term contamination. They were using ground-penetrating radar, a technology that was far more advanced than anything available in 1982. For weeks, their work was routine, documenting soil composition and searching for buried contaminants. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, they got a hit. It was a significant anomaly, located in a remote sector several miles from the main plant, in an area that had no business having anything buried in it. The reading indicated a large, dense, metallic object, roughly the size of an industrial drum, buried 15 feet below the surface. The technicians checked their historical maps. There were no pipelines, no wells, no authorized disposal sites in this location. It was a ghost in their machine. They ran the scan again. The reading was clear and consistent. A senior geologist on the team, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, coincidentally the younger brother of Julian's editor Marcus, felt a prickle of unease. He knew the history of the area, the whispers of illegal dumping, and the story of the vanished journalist. While there was no logical reason to connect this anomaly to that cold case, the location felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too isolated. This wasn't a lost piece of equipment. This was something that had been intentionally hidden. He made a call, not to his superiors at the EPA, but to a contact at the FBI. He reported the anomaly as a potential hazardous waste violation, but added a crucial speculative note. He mentioned the proximity to where Julian Hayes' car had been found and the long-standing rumors about TerraCorp. It was a long shot, a gut feeling based on old stories, but it was enough. That single coincidental discovery by a man with a tangential connection to the case was the catalyst. It set in motion a chain of events that would finally force the desert to give up its dead. The mystery was no longer cold. A flicker of heat had just been detected deep beneath the sand. The FBI took Dr. Thorne's tip seriously. The potential for a major environmental crime combined with an infamous cold case was too compelling to ignore. A federal excavation team was dispatched to the remote desert location, led by a sharp, unyielding special agent named Maria Miller. She had a reputation for solving impossible cases. She cordoned off the area, shutting out the local authorities, including the now-retired Sheriff Brody, who watched the federal activity from a distance with a nervous curiosity. The excavation was slow and methodical. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights that turned the desert night into an eerie stage, heavy machinery carefully scraped away layers of sand and rock. Hours turned into a full day. Finally, the backhoe operator hit something solid with a dull, metallic thud. The team switched to hand tools, painstakingly digging around the object. Soon, its shape became clear. It was a 55-gallon industrial drum, its surface pitted with rust but otherwise intact. It was sealed shut, the lid welded on. A hazardous materials team was brought in to carefully lift the drum from its sandy grave. It was transported to a secure mobile forensic lab set up nearby. The air was thick with anticipation. Agent Miller gave the order to open it. Technicians in full hazmat suits used a plasma cutter to slice through the lid. As it was lifted away, a pungent chemical odor filled the lab. Inside, submerged in a thick, gelatinous, foul-smelling slurry of industrial solvents, were the remains of a human body. Alongside the skeletal remains, miraculously preserved by the chemical cocktail, was a small, heavy object. A technician carefully lifted it out. It was a 35mm camera, its metal body corroded but its internal components seemingly protected. This was the moment the case broke wide open. The remains were quickly identified through dental records sent from Julian's family dentist 12 years prior. It was Julian Hayes. The "what happened" was now a murder investigation. The why and who were still a mystery, but Miller suspected the answer was inside that camera. The forensic team worked for 3 days in a darkroom, delicately extracting and attempting to develop the film. They managed to salvage a single strip. The photos were grainy, chaotic, and taken in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the harsh, direct light of the camera's flash. The first few frames were blurry shots of the desert floor. Then a clear image. 2 men in TerraCorp work uniforms rolling a drum identical to the one Julian was found in towards a deep pit. Another photo showed a third man standing off to the side, overseeing the operation. He was holding a shovel. The final photo was the bombshell. It was a close-up taken in a moment of desperate confrontation. One of the men had turned directly towards Julian's lens, his face a mask of shock and fury, perfectly captured in the flash's glare. His face was younger, but there was no mistaking him. It was Sheriff Brody. The truth was finally exposed, developed in a chemical bath just like the body of the man who had died to capture it. Julian hadn't gotten lost. He had found exactly what he was looking for, and it had cost him his life. The revelation from the photograph triggered a swift and decisive endgame. Agent Miller didn't wait. With the photograph as undeniable evidence, she and a team of federal agents drove directly to the quiet, suburban home of the retired Sheriff Brody. He was in his garden, watering roses, a picture of peaceful retirement. When he saw Miller and her team approaching, the color drained from his face. He knew why they were there. In the interrogation room, faced with a large print of the photo from Julian's camera, Brody's carefully constructed composure crumbled. His confession tumbled out, a torrent of guilt and self-preservation that had been dammed up for 12 years. He laid out the entire conspiracy. TerraCorp had been paying him and a handful of other town officials handsomely for years to ignore their illegal dumping activities. The company saved millions, and the officials got rich. It was a dirty, simple arrangement that kept the town's economy afloat and their own pockets lined. Julian Hayes was the unforeseen complication. His persistent questions and refusal to be intimidated had made them nervous. When Brody learned from a TerraCorp security contact that Julian had the map and was heading out to the dump site that night, he knew the entire scheme was about to implode. He and 2 TerraCorp security guards, the other men in the photographs, drove out to intercept him. They didn't intend to kill him, Brody claimed, only to scare him off, to destroy his camera and evidence. But Julian fought back. He refused to be silenced and managed to snap that one damning photo in the chaos. A struggle ensued, and one of the security guards struck Julian in the head with a shovel. It was a single, fatal blow. Panicked, they made a desperate decision. They would hide his body in the most secure place they could think of, inside one of the very toxic waste drums he was there to expose. They placed him and his camera inside, welded it shut, and buried it with the others, confident it would never be found. For 12 years, Brody had lived with the secret, his guilt assuaged by the comfort and security his blood money had bought him. The subsequent investigation was a firestorm. The 2 former TerraCorp guards were arrested, and their confessions corroborated Brody's story. Federal investigators seized TerraCorp's old financial records, uncovering the bribery scheme and implicating several other former town officials. The why was brutally simple: greed. A journalist's life had been weighed against millions of dollars in illegal profits and personal payoffs, and had been found wanting. The entire corrupt ecosystem that had festered in Black Rock Flats was finally dragged into the light. The resolution of the case brought answers, but not peace. For Eleanor and Sarah, the news was a complex and brutal form of closure. Agent Miller met with them personally, treating them with a compassion and respect that had been absent 12 years earlier. She returned to them the few personal effects recovered from the drum: a tarnished silver ring, Julian's wedding band, and his water-damaged wallet. Holding the ring in her palm, the same ring she had placed on his finger on their wedding day, Eleanor finally broke down. The grief was as raw and immediate as it had been on the day he was first reported missing, but it was now mixed with the bitter taste of vindication. They had been right all along. He hadn't been careless. He had been murdered for being brave. Sarah, now 18 years old, was a young woman who had grown up with a myth instead of a father. Agent Miller showed her the photographs from Julian's camera. She stared at the last image her father ever took, the grainy picture of his own killer, a testament to his refusal to back down even in the face of death. In that moment, something shifted within her. The phantom of her father became real. He was no longer just a sad story. He was a hero who had captured the truth at the cost of his own life. The pain of her loss was still immense, but it was now infused with a profound sense of pride and purpose. She saw his legacy not as a burden of grief, but as a torch to be carried. A few weeks later, she sat down at her mother's old typewriter and wrote the first sentence of her application essay for journalism school. The relief of knowing the truth was inextricably tangled with the agony of that truth. The years of uncertainty were over, but the years of loss could never be recovered. The family finally had the final chapter of Julian's story, a brutal, heartbreaking, but necessary ending that allowed them, at long last, to begin the process of truly mourning him. Julian Hayes's death was a tragedy born of corruption, but his legacy became a powerful symbol of journalistic integrity. The story of his murder and the subsequent uncovering of the TerraCorp conspiracy became a national sensation. It was a stark illustration of the depths of corporate greed and the dangers faced by those who dare to expose it. The case did not end with the convictions of Brody and his accomplices. It sparked a massive, multi-year federal investigation into TerraCorp's practices nationwide, uncovering a pattern of environmental crimes and cover-ups that led to one of the largest corporate fines in EPA history. The public outcry was immense. The story of a journalist being murdered to silence him struck a nerve, highlighting the vulnerability of the free press. In response to lobbying from press freedom organizations and a groundswell of public support, Congress passed new legislation 2 years later. It became informally known as the Hayes Act, a federal law that expanded protections for journalists investigating corporate and governmental malfeasance, creating stiffer penalties for threats and intimidation. The case served as a universal lesson. The pursuit of truth is often a perilous endeavor, but it is a necessary one. Julian's individual story transcended his personal tragedy to become a testament to the idea that a single, determined person can, even in death, hold immense power to account. The community of Black Rock Flats was forced to reckon with its own complicity of silence. The story became a permanent part of its history, a cautionary tale not about the dangers of the desert, but about the poison of corruption. One man's search for the truth cost him his life, but 12 years later, that very truth rose from the desert to demand justice. His courage left behind a legacy that proves that while a story can be buried, it can never truly be silenced. If this story of courage and corruption moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime mysteries. Tell us in the comments, do you believe all the responsible parties were brought to justice, or could the conspiracy have gone even higher?